Chapter 6 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Vendetti. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 6. Alfred the Great. More than 1,000 years ago, England was composed of a number of small kingdoms, which were as separate and distinct as the nations of the world are today. They were either making war upon each other or looking on at the wars of their neighbors, and it seemed impossible, and nobody ever dreamed at that time, that England and Scotland and Wales would be united into one great state. Among these people were the yellow-haired Saxons, who had entered England as invaders and driven the Celts to the westward. The Saxons brought with them the ideas that they practiced in the region north of Gaul, whence they came. They refused to live in walled towns and tore down or abandoned the buildings left by the Romans, erecting their own mud huts outside the ramparts. Their homes were rude indeed, and they had few comforts and luxuries. Glass was unknown to them, and the cold rain and wind swept through their dwellings. They had no books in their own tongue, and got all their learning from a few scholars and priests. But in spite of all these drawbacks, they were a brave and hardy people, lacking only a great leader to become a nation whose influence would be felt throughout the world. For a time, however, no such leader appeared, and it seemed as if they must be swept away entirely by a new enemy that came upon them from the north, a people called respectively the Danes, the Northmen, and the Vikings, who lived on the shores of the creeks and fjords of what is now Denmark and the Scandinavian peninsula, a wild and hardy race of sailors who loved fighting and gained their livelihood by piracy, sweeping forth in their open boats upon unprotected shores and burning and plundering wherever they went. The Northmen, who were great seamen, speedily found out that because the British Isles were divided into numerous small nations, there would be no concerted resistance when they came to plunder, and forthwith the people of the English kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia beheld to their dismay a number of strange piratical craft upon the shores. The prows of the boats were shaped like dragons' heads, and round shields ran along the gunwales beside the rowers. From these boats came pouring out a wild horde of gigantic and bloodthirsty men, heavily armed, ravens' wings attached to their helmets, and long hair streaming over their armor. The Saxons quickly learned that it was well to flee when these men appeared, otherwise they would be mercilessly slain. Even the women and little children were not spared, for the Northmen used to make a sport of butchery, and when they fought with the English armies they were nearly always victorious, for they were trained soldiers, accustomed constantly to war, with better weapons and better armor than the English. Such was the state of affairs in England when Ethelwulf reigned over the kingdom of Wessex. Ethelwulf was an easy-going king who loved prayer better than fighting, but was forced again and again to defend his kingdom from the Northmen. He had a wife named Osberga, and 5 sons who were called Ethelstane, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, Ethelred, and Alfred. The 2 oldest of these, Ethelstane and Ethelbald, aided their father in defending the country, while the others were trained in hunting and warlike exercises with the same purpose in view. But Alfred, when only 5 years old, was sent by King Ethelwulf upon a pilgrimage to the holy city of Rome, to receive there the blessings of Pope Leo IV, who was head of the Christian Church, and a ruler far mightier than any other in the world. It is not to be thought that so young a child was sent alone on such a journey, which would require months to finish, and on which many dangers would have to be encountered. With Alfred were many soldiers and retainers, and also a famous churchman called Bishop Swithin, who later became a saint. The object of this journey was to have the Pope's blessing brought back to England by Alfred, and to show the Pope, by sending a royal prince so far for such a purpose, what devout Christians the people of Wessex were. Ethelwulf himself had desired to go to Rome, but the danger from the Danes was too great and too near at hand. However, after some months, he believed he could safely join Alfred, who, although so young, could never forget the marvels that he beheld in the Holy City. Ethelwulf also desired to seek a wife in France, for Alfred's mother, Arasberga, had died since her son departed for Rome. In due time, Ethelwulf and Alfred came back from Rome to Wessex, where great troubles awaited them. Ethelstane had died, and during Ethelwulf's absence, Ethelbald had revolted, and was trying to take the kingdom away from his own father by force of arms. A number of nobles had joined Ethelbald, because they believed that he was the better soldier, and would protect them more sturdily against the Northmen. The people were also enraged against Ethelwulf, because when crossing France he had married a French princess named Judith, who was only 14 years old, and had caused her to be proclaimed queen, which was against the laws of the Saxons. True to his peaceful nature, Ethelwulf refused to fight against Ethelbald. He said he would never draw a sword against his own flesh and blood, no matter what wrong had been done to him. Moreover, that it behooved the English to draw their swords against their common enemy, the Northmen, rather than to wrangle amongst themselves when the invader might appear upon their shores at any moment. And Ethelwulf agreed to divide his kingdom with his son, to whom he gave the more important and valuable part, and spent the rest of his life in following the church and its doings. Still a king in name, to be sure, but with little of the kingly power remaining in his hands. The baseness of his son in turning against him, however, broke the heart of the old king, and Ethelwulf soon died, leaving the small part of his kingdom which he continued to rule to his son, Ethelbert. Like his father, this prince was of a peaceful disposition and did little to stop the raids of the Northmen, never appearing himself against his enemies, but spending his time in prayer and divine worship. Nor was his disposition changed when the base Ethelbald died and the entire kingdom was reunited. The Danes once more made a bold raid against the city of Winchester, burning a large part of it and escaping with much plunder. But before they were able to return to their boats, they were cut off by a force of English men-at-arms and archers, led by the aldermen of Hampshire and Berkshire, and almost all the invaders were slain. Even in this grave conflict, King Ethelbert was not present, and the victory of the English was not due to their king. Alfred, however, who was now 11 years old, gave signs that if ever he gained the throne of Wessex, his enemies would have good reason to fear him. Although a young boy, he used to love to go on foot in the dark forest to hunt the fierce wild boars that lived there, a dangerous sport, even for a grown man. He also gave every promise that some day he might be a great ruler, and bring the people of England to peace and safety. For not only was he bold and proficient in arms and manly exercises, but a diligent scholar who spent a great part of his time in acquiring wisdom. And of all his brothers, Alfred loved Prince Ethelred best. And when he grew older, the two brothers fought side by side against the Danes. When Alfred was 19, the Danes raided England again, but did not enter the kingdom of Wessex. And there was so weak a bond between the small English kingdoms that none of the untroubled states felt it their part to go and help their neighbors. After this, the Danes invaded East Anglia and captured the king of that country, whose name was Edmund. They offered to spare his life if he would give up Christianity and believe in their own gods, whose names were Odin and Thor. He refused, and they beheaded him. Later the head was found watched over by a wolf, and all the people believed that it had been preserved by a miracle. So Edmund became a saint, and many churches throughout England were built in his honor. Then the Danes raided Wessex, and terrible trouble began. Ethelred was now king, and Alfred was old enough to go to the wars and take command of the army. So he and his brother went forth against the Danes together, at the head of every available fighting man who could be mustered to bear a spear. The Danes had rowed up the river Thames and captured the town of Reading. Ethelred and Alfred attempted to recapture it from them, but pouring out of the gates of the town, they routed the English forces. They then marched along the banks of the Thames, where they had an idea of settling and holding the land. The king and Alfred worked desperately to collect their scattered soldiers and lead them again to the combat. At last they gathered a sufficient number and moved against the Danes at Berkshire Downs. They were advancing to the attack when the Danes poured down the hillside toward them. King Ethelred was at prayers and refused to fight until he had finished. But Alfred, seeing that the English would be defeated if they did not attack at once, took command of the entire army and charged fiercely against the Danes, himself in the foremost rank, a target for the arrows and spears of all his enemies. So fierce was his onslaught, and such was the enthusiasm of the soldiers whom he led, that, although the Danes outnumbered the English, the pirates were put to flight with terrible slaughter. A Danish king and 5 earls were killed in this fierce conflict, in memory of which the people of Berkshire cut into the white chalk of the downs the giant figure of a horse, a figure that can be seen at the present day, in the honor of the victory of more than 1,000 years ago. The Danes, however, though checked, were not sufficiently weakened by this fight to give up thoughts of capturing Wessex, and soon were harrying and plundering again. In another battle with them, King Ethelred received his death blow, and upon his death, Alfred, who was still a very young man, became king. It was a sad entry into the powers of kingship. Practically all of England, except Wessex, was at the mercy of the Danes, who came so fast and in so many different directions, that when the king had started against one hostile band, he would get word of others who had landed and perhaps were burning and plundering the very country he had just left. Alfred was as shrewd as he was brave, and he knew that if his people could not have a respite from wars and a chance to organize themselves, they must end by submitting wholly to the Northmen. So he offered the Danes a large sum of money to leave Wessex in peace for 4 years. This was accepted by the sea robbers. They believed that they could find rich booty elsewhere and return to Essex when they chose. And with the English gold in their pouches, they sailed from Alfred's dominions. Now the king had not bought the Danes off because he was too cowardly to fight with them further. Rather did he plan to strengthen his nation for future fighting, and the Danes were highly foolish to accept his terms. No sooner were their sails out of sight than Alfred commenced to build a navy so that he would be able to meet them equally when they next came against him, and he studied the Danish craft to serve as models for the English boats. The galleys of the Northmen were pointed at both ends and could be rowed in either direction. There were generally from 15 to 30 rowers on either side, and the boats also carried a number of extra soldiers. They were provided also with square sails pitched about amidships, and were steered by a large paddle. These boats were excellent in creeks and rivers, but owing to their low bulwarks were somewhat unseaworthy, and it was necessary for the Danes to cross the sea and the English Channel in fair weather. For 4 years the Danes left Alfred alone, but after the time agreed upon had expired, they sent a powerful army into Wessex. Alfred at once marched against them and came upon them in Wareham, where he was able to surround them in their camp and starve them until they cried for peace. He then made a treaty with them, agreeing to allow them to pass unmolested back to their ships, in return for which they were to trouble his kingdom no more. The Danes, however, like most barbarians, were extremely treacherous. They pretended to fall in with Alfred's plans, but in the night, when the English had relaxed their vigilance, they stole past his army and fortified themselves in a strong position, preparing for a siege of many months. At this, all the English thanes barons and lords became discouraged. They came to King Alfred and told him that they could not fight any longer. It would be better, they declared, to submit to the invaders rather than to undergo the ceaseless war and bloodshed that tortured their land. And Alfred, as he listened to them, knew that every word of what they said was the truth. But the stout-hearted king had no intention of submitting to the Danes. When his nobles were through speaking, Alfred cried, "As long as there is a single man who can wield a sword, I will fight on. Nay, I will fight alone with none to help me, sooner than surrender my kingdom to the barbarians." At this, a lad who was at the gathering drew his sword and shouted, "And I will follow you, my king, wherever you lead me." And the nobles returned to Alfred's side and took heart to continue the unequal war. At the head of his army, Alfred pursued the Danes to Exeter and laid siege to it. And now it was manifest that he had shown great wisdom in building a fleet, for the English ships prevented reinforcements from joining the Danes, who finally were forced to surrender and were driven from the country. And many pirate ships were sunk by Alfred's vessels. In the winter, however, the Danes came again, in such numbers that the English could not withstand them. The coast swarmed with the pirate galleys, and bands of marauders entered Wessex, plundering and burning in every direction. Alfred knew that for the time being further resistance against them was hopeless, and with his wife and only a handful of faithful followers, he fled to the marshes of Athelney, where he remained in the strictest hiding. To all intents and purposes, England had become a Danish country, and even the English nobles did not know what had become of their king. While in hiding, Alfred had numerous strange adventures, which are told in various old chronicles and legends. On one occasion, when caught in a snowstorm, he sought shelter in the hut of a swineherd, who knew him, but who was so faithful to him that even his wife was not taken into the secret. Alfred, who was poorly dressed, was given the task of watching some loaves of bread which were baking on the hearth. But troubled with gloomy thoughts, he did not give as strict an eye to them as he should have done, but suffered them to burn. When the swineherd's wife came back and found the burning bread, she rated the king soundly for his carelessness. "Idle lout," she cried, "thou couldst not keep an eye on the bread, although thou wouldst be glad to fill thy belly with it. Play another trick of the kind, and I will thwack thee on the snout." The king said nothing, but in better days, when he had regained his kingdom, he is said to have presented the honest couple with a fine house and land as a reward for their hospitality, if not for their politeness. While in hiding, Alfred was constantly planning how it would be possible to vanquish the Danes. And another story tells of how he disguised himself as a musician and boldly entered the Danish lines to learn for himself how great their numbers might be. Here he wandered from one campfire to another, harping and singing, all the while keeping his eyes and ears open, and escaping at last with information that would ensure his victory when the cold weather departed. In the spring the king came forth from his hiding place and sent forth messengers with a proclamation to the Saxons that they were to join him at a place he gave them word of, for once again they would fight to free their country from the foreign yoke. The place where he commanded them to meet him was by a rock in the midst of a forest, which was known as Egbert's Stone. Here the thanes assembled with their forces, and great was their rejoicing when they beheld Alfred again, for they believed that he had been killed or had fled to France or Italy. With drawn swords they swore undying devotion and fealty to him, and shouted for him to lead them as speedily as possible against the Danes. In spite of their patriotism, Alfred's army was far smaller than that of the Danes, and he knew that to succeed he must surprise them. The Danes were at a place called Ethandune, and Alfred came upon them by night marches and by passing so far as possible through little frequented paths. When the sea robbers finally saw the army of the Saxons, they could hardly stir for amazement, for they had believed themselves absolute masters of all England, and were bringing their women and children from the north. But here were the Saxons and their king, fully armed, their banners flaming in the sunlight. The battle raged all day, and in it lay the fate of England. If the Danes won, the last chance of the Saxons under Alfred would have departed, and the country most necessarily become like the other countries of the far north. At nightfall, however, the pirates gave way, and for protection fled into a fortress on Bratton Hill, where the Saxons surrounded them and besieged them. The Northmen at last ran out of food and were forced to surrender. The result of this battle was a treaty between Alfred and the Danes. The Danish king Guthrum desired to settle in England, where he had lived for many months, and sent messengers to Alfred, offering to be baptized as a Christian, promising never again to bear arms against the people of Wessex. Alfred accepted the Danish proposal gladly, for his people were weary to death of war and hardship, and needed peace to till their lands. So Alfred, while he probably could have conquered all England, left the Danes in the part that had been most thoroughly conquered by them, calling it the Danelaw, and gave the Danes permission to live there unmolested, providing they promised to disturb his kingdom no further. The pact held good, and although at times it was broken, in general it was adhered to for many years. Saxons and Danes intermingled and married into the families of their enemies, and from them a new people gradually came into being. As soon as peace was assured, Alfred provided against future attacks on the part of the Northmen by ordering all the forts and strongholds throughout the kingdom of Wessex to be rebuilt and put into good order. He knew that the Danes could not be trusted, and feared that at any time new galleys might be seen bearing down upon the English coast. So he organized his army into several parts, and thought out a system by means of which soldiers might always be on guard duty to withstand an invasion, while the rest of the people were peacefully tilling the soil. He also framed a code of laws. In the war and confusion into which his country had been thrown, the laws had fallen into a sorry state, and were frequently disobeyed. In his code, Alfred did not introduce new laws, which his people disliked, but rather arranged and put in order the laws then existing, and his dominions soon became so orderly and so free from robbers that it is doubtful if all our police could do better today. Also the king found that the law had been hindered and impeded by many corrupt and worthless judges, some of whom knew nothing whatever about the duties of their office, and these he warned to study and acquaint themselves with what a judge must know, or renounce their positions in law altogether. Then the Danes came again. They landed with a large army and tried to take Rochester Castle. Alfred hastened to the relief of this fortress, which was a most important one, and drove them away, pressing them so hard that they scrambled on their way to their vessels and set sail for the open sea. However, the Danes did not go back to their native land, but landed in Essex, where they were joined by their countrymen in the Danelaw, who thus broke the word that they had pledged to Alfred. The new Danish army was much larger than Alfred's, and at first was victorious, but the entire navy of Wessex came to the rescue of the English and vanquished 16 Danish ships in a tremendous sea fight. The war then raged with varying fortunes until Alfred signed another agreement with Guthrum, and he laid siege to London, which had been taken by the Danes. In due time London fell. Its capture gave Alfred a tremendous advantage over his enemies. He had the city strongly fortified, and it stood as a barrier to Danish vessels that strove to work their way up the River Thames. Moreover, it became one of the world's greatest trading centers, and merchants from all quarters of the earth visited it. When the Danes were finally defeated, Alfred, according to his custom, lost no time in building up his kingdom. First of all, he commenced to rebuild the monasteries and abbeys, which had been destroyed by the invaders. The first one he founded was at Athelney, in Somersetshire, in the midst of the marshes where he had fled for refuge when the Danes overran his country. He also founded a number of other monasteries and abbeys, among them the abbey at Shaftesbury, making his daughter Ethelgeda the abbess. Alfred loved books and learning, and had made his chief aim in life to acquire wisdom. He knew that if his people were to become really great, they must labor in the arts and letters and acquire knowledge from books. Practically all the books of that time were written in Latin, which few could read. So Alfred set himself about the task of making translations of the best and most valuable books of his day. The translation was done either under his direct care or by his own hand, and the boon to his people was greater than can be told. Alfred ordered the famous Anglo-Saxon Chronicle to be written, which was designed by him to treasure up for future and historical happenings of his own time. To make the most of his time, the king divided the day into 3 periods of 8 hours each. In the first of these he labored for the church, in the second for his kingdom, and the third he devoted to rest and recreation. But although he labored hard and gained much by performing these good and wise deeds, Alfred had not yet heard the last of his old enemies, the Danes, who were to trouble him almost to the end of his life. After the defeats they had suffered at his hands, they had turned toward Europe and followed there their usual course, killing and plundering and bearing the women and children into slavery. At last, however, they were defeated in battle by the Emperor of Germany, and they turned once more to England, where they hoped the heroic king had relaxed his vigilance. Under the great Viking Hastings, a large force of them landed in Kent, and prepared to ravage the country. Alfred sent his eldest son, named Edward, to keep close watch upon their movements, ordering him, however, not to engage them in battle until he himself should arrive with the bulk of the army. When he was on the march, and when the Danes knew that a large force was advancing against them, they tried once more their old trick of pretending friendship in order to throw their enemies off their guard. Hastings sent to Alfred professions of friendship, and to show his apparent good faith, sent with the messengers his 2 sons, requesting that they be baptized as Christians. Alfred received the 2 Dane princes with great joy. After they were baptized, he welcomed them to a feast, and sent them to their father with many costly presents. The Danish plan succeeded, for by their professions of friendship, the English relaxed their watchfulness and gave their enemies an opportunity to plunder and ravage the country and maneuver themselves into a position favorable to withstand either siege or battle. And Prince Edward sent word to his father that the Danes were doing these things and that he was unable to withstand them. Then Alfred, at the head of his army, joined his son and came up with the Danes at a place called Farnham in Surrey. There he met them in battle, and the bravery of Prince Edward was largely responsible for the victory that followed. The Danes were utterly routed, and many of their galleys fell into the hands of the English, with many women and children. And among these prisoners were the wife of Hastings and his 2 sons, who had so recently been baptized. And when Alfred learned who they were, he sent them back to Hastings in spite of his treachery, and, not content with doing this, loaded them down with more presents for the Danish king. The work of defeating the Danes was not yet finished, for they were in many different strongholds which must all be captured before the country could be wholly rid of them. But after several campaigns, Alfred saw, if he could obstruct the river Lee near London, he would strand their ships and be able to attack them at his pleasure. The king accomplished his ingenious design by digging a number of ditches, and soon drained the water from the river into another channel. And when the Danes beheld that their ships would soon be useless to them, they took flight, pursued by Alfred's soldiers. Hastings then sought to go back to the Danish women and children on the few boats that were left to him, and finally sailed away for good and all, with only a small part of his vast force with which he had attempted to conquer England. And Alfred saw how mistaken he had been to show any kindness to Hastings' force, and had some Danish prisoners hanged as a lesson to the freebooters. For 4 years thereafter, Alfred was able to lead a peaceful life and continue the good works that were to change history and make England a nation in other things than mere force of arms. All his life, however, the king had suffered from a disease that afflicted him sorely, and it was only his great spirit that enabled him to continue so arduously in the wars and labors that made him greater than all others. In the year 901, or close to that time, he died, and was succeeded by his son Edward, who bravely defended his country against any further attacks by the Danes, becoming after his father one of England's greatest kings, known as Edward the Elder. 1,000 years after Alfred's death, a great festival was held in his honor in the city of Winchester, which he had defended against the Danes, and where he was buried. His statue stands there today, watching over and guarding the great nation that would not be in the world at all if his hand and heart had failed it. End of chapter 6. Recording by Mike Vendetti. Florence, Colorado. www.mikevendetti.com